What up guys, my name is Ace, and in this video I will explain a bunch of lesser known and not so well explained Albion mechanics. My plan was to make a YouTube short for each of these, but I realized that I needed more than 1 minute to talk about some of these. As always, there's a table of content on your screen right now in case you want to skip around to sections that seem interesting to you, or want to skip a mechanic that you already know. Clickable timestamps will also be in the description below. Speaking of, there will also be links to all relevant sources, like spreadsheets and wiki links, down in the description for you to check out. Let's start with Focus Fire Protection, also known as Resilience. Resilience gives you a percentage less damage taken buff depending on how many people have hit you in the last 5 seconds. Resilience can give a maximum of 80% less damage taken from all sources and ramps up quite quickly. Focus Fire Protection, together with AoE Escalation, is the reason that fighting heavily outnumbered is even close to possible. Resilience, however, is ignored in part by another mechanic called Resilience Penetration. Speaking of which, Resilience Penetration is a stat on most melee weapons and Astral Staff, and is the most blatant example of the game not telling you exactly what it does. As a new player, I used to think it was a percentage armor shred, however it's not. Resilience Penetration allows your attacks and abilities to ignore a percentage of the previously mentioned Focus Fire Protection buff. A quick example. An enemy player has the max resilience buff of 80%, and in a 1v1 scenario would take 100 damage from your auto attacks. You are wearing a one-handed dagger which has 50% resilience penetration. A weapon without this stat would do 20 damage to the target, but the 50% resilience penetration of the dagger reduces the resilience buff by 50%, making it go from 80% less damage taken to 40%. So your auto attacks now deal 60 damage instead of 20. AoE Escalation is a mechanic in Albion that makes your AoE damaging abilities do more damage the more enemy players they hit. For each enemy you hit, you gain an 8% damage bonus, starting once you hit at least 2 enemies. This 8% damage bonus can stack up to 7 times for a 56% damage bonus when hitting 8 or more people. I have already made 3 videos about this topic by now, and when I tested all AoE abilities for the first time, I showed that a lot of the abilities simply didn't get the damage bonus even though they should have. Since then, SPI has fixed a lot of these abilities. I have more recently tested all abilities again, and there are still a few outliers in terms of abilities that should, in my opinion, get AoE Escalation. The main ones being One-Handed Fiery and Snare Charge. If you'd like to know exactly which abilities do or do not get escalated, there will be a link in the description to a spreadsheet I made with almost all abilities tested. A little fun fact about this mechanic is that mobs do not count towards your escalation buff. However, they do take the increase of damage if you also hit more than one player together with the mobs. So technically, fame farming while also hitting enemy players is quite a bit faster. There are 2 types of healing sickness in Albion. The most common form of healing sickness is having multiple healers in your party. If an ally gets healed by more than one healer, they get a debuff that reduces their healing received. Note that only Holy and Nature abilities proc this debuff. Life-stealing abilities, passives, and root-bound Qs and Ws do not proc this debuff. However, an arcane mimicking protection of nature will. The more uncommon form of healing sickness is self-healing sickness. Holy and Nature get this debuff by pressing Q on themselves 10 and 6 times respectively without healing any allies with Qs in between. This debuff cuts all healing received by 40% for 2 minutes. In most group content this is not very relevant, however this can be a deadly debuff in 2v2 Hellgates and solo content. Healing an ally with a Q will immediately remove this debuff from the healer. Since nature Qs heal over time, you might be wondering when healing an ally refreshes this counter to 0. It only resets the counter back to 0 the moment you press Q on an ally, not on the last tick of healing received. Next up is combat, and the way I see combat is that you're always in one of 3 combat states. These are: the default state is out of combat. While in this state, you can change the equipment you're using, change abilities, regenerate health passively, and change between zones. The inactive combat state is when you are getting hit, but haven't done anything back to your enemies. In this state, you cannot change the items you're using, change abilities, or regenerate health passively. However, you can change zones. The active combat state is when you are hitting, or debuffing, an enemy, or healing an ally that is. While in this state, you cannot change the items you're using, change abilities, regenerate health passively, or change zones. The inactive and active combat states both last for 20 seconds. With the help of How to Hype, I actually tested almost every debuff, shield, and weird ability in the game for exactly what puts you into combat, and there are quite a few fun outliers. I will, in the future, also make a full 10-minute video going deep on exactly what does and does not put you in combat. However, a few highlights are that reflects, by themselves, do not put you in active combat. Something like Frost Shield will though, as you are also slowing the enemy. So popping a Hunter Hood for the defense while trying to run away is a solid strategy. Another weird thing we discovered is that shielding allies with certain abilities does put you in combat, but shielding them with other abilities does not. Cooldown reduction is not necessarily a mechanic, but a stat. This stat decreases the cooldown of all of your abilities. However, this stat is heavily influenced by diminishing returns. If you only have one source of cooldown reduction, this will never get influenced by diminishing returns. However, the more sources you add, the more stats you end up losing. With some loose math I did, it shows you how much you actually lose from stacking multiple sources. With all 3 letter passives, an A3 Mistcaller, and an A3 Omelet, you actually lose almost 40% of the cooldown reduction you tried to add after the first item. The most common thing is to pair an Omelet and a Mistcaller, but this loses you almost 30% of the value of the Pork Omelet. I talk about diminishing returns in general next, however I wanted to specify cooldown reduction as I see a lot of people stacking 2, 3, or sometimes even 4 sources of this stat. And in a lot of cases, it's simply better to go for another stat than waste 30 or up to 40% of your item's power on diminishing returns. Diminishing returns lowers your stats gained when trying to combine multiple sources. I've talked about cooldown reduction specifically, but other stats like cast speed, defense versus players, and CC resistance all have this mechanic to an extent. To show this in action, I have a small demonstration. Most perma players use a Scholar Robe and Pork Omelets. Your cast speed with just the Scholar Robe active is 0.6 seconds. With an Omelet, this becomes 0.56 seconds, a meager 0.04 seconds decrease, even though Omelets are supposed to add a 13.5% cast speed. For PvP reasons, a Beef Stew or an Eel Stew might be a better option. As a perma, you are mainly trying to clap and play safe afterwards. The days of standing still and queuing are mostly over. So the 0.04 seconds difference isn't very relevant while clapping, but the 13.5% damage increase certainly is. Of course, when you're doing PvE, a Pork Omelet might still be better, as you are actually able to constantly be casting Qs. Playing Permafrost with Robe and Sandals on cast speed passive is a massive waste. Playing a tank with a Sarcophagus or Aegis Shield with defense passive on armor just isn't ideal. Mastery Modifier is a stat on all equipable gear tier 5 and above, starting at 5% at tier 5 gear and going up by 5% per tier up to 20% at tier 8. This modifier increases the bonus item power you get from your Destiny board. For example, on Scholar Cows, I currently gain an extra item power of 260 from my Destiny board. On a flat 4 Scholar Cow, I would therefore gain a bonus of 260 item power. On a flat 5 Scholar Cow, I would get the 260 bonus item power from my Destiny board, but an extra 13 from the 5% mastery modifier the item has. A flat 8 Scholar Cow gives me a bonus of 52 item power from my mastery modifier. Since the base item power of a 4-1 and a flat 5 item are the exact same, a flat 5 item is always slightly stronger. For an item on which you have around 100 spec, this is a 1% increase in total item power. However, comparing a 5-3 item to a flat 8, this goes up to 2.6% increase of total item power. The more spec you have, the bigger the difference becomes. With my far over 600 spec on nature staffs, the difference between a 5-3 and a flat 8 nature is almost 3.5%. I often get the question on how important spec is, and how much spec the person needs to start doing 4vx. And after getting DM'd specifically asking me how important IP actually is, I decided to give it a quick test. Here is the spreadsheet. I will, for the sake of this video, remove all of the unimportant data so it's easier for us to go over. The tier of the nature staff is irrelevant. We should only be looking at the total IP of the item and how much healing output we get from it. For your information, all of these tests were done with a one-handed nature staff, so results may vary with different nature staffs. Taking a flat 6 nature staff as our weapon of choice, you can see the base healing output of a Q is 23 health per second. Getting 100 spec in one-handed nature will increase this to 26 health per second. Leveling all the other nature staffs to 100 and putting 120 spec in one-handed nature increases this to 28 health per second. Only once you fully 120 spec the entire nature tree do you get to 29 health per second. I personally don't think leveling your nature past 5 or 600 is particularly worth it. the silver and time investment becomes too big for the mediocre results you get. Feel free to disagree with me though. For some, that extra tiny bit of healing for an insane amount of work will be worth it. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope some of this information was useful. I plan on making more of these videos in the future, diving into more niche mechanics, or trying to figure out the importance of IP on other weapon lines. If you have any ideas of mechanics, stats, or generally interesting things you want solved and I could test to put in a video, please leave them in a comment below, and I will make sure to include them in the next video. If any of my math is wrong, or anything I claim is misguided, please let me know in a comment below as well. If anything in this video is wrong, I will make a pinned comment rectifying what I said, so nobody leaves this video with wrong information. Once again, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.